He asked for nothing but a glass of water. The flight attendant glanced at him, then turned away, ignoring him like he wasn't even there. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. And she definitely didn't know his family owned the very airline she worked for. By the time the plane landed, her entire world would come crashing down. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The plane's cabin hummed with a low murmur of passengers settling into their seats. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp chill of the air conditioning. Among the travelers in first class, Father Dorian Hale sat quietly by the window, his fingers loosely wrapped around the armrest. He was dressed in a black buttoned-up shirt with a thin silver chain peeking from beneath the collar, a sign of his faith. His presence was calm, unassuming, yet there was something about him that carried a quiet strength. He adjusted his seatbelt and looked ahead, his expression unreadable as he observed the attendants moving up and down the aisle. He had been on many flights before, yet this one would be different in a way no one on board expected. A few rows ahead, Julia Vaughn straightened her uniform, glancing around the cabin with a sharp, practiced eye. She had been working flights for years, long enough to recognize the usual passengers. Business executives, high-profile clients, and wealthy travelers who expected nothing less than perfection. But when her gaze landed on Dorian, something in her expression shifted. Her eyes flickered with the smallest hint of disapproval before she quickly masked it with professionalism. She moved past him without a second glance, offering welcoming smiles to others, engaging in polite conversation with passengers who fit the image of first class. Dorian didn't react. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this happen before, more times than he cared to count. The plane doors closed with a final click, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, announcing their departure. As the aircraft rolled onto the runway, Dorian leaned his head back, letting his eyes drift shut for a moment. He hadn't slept much the night before, and the exhaustion weighed heavy on his body. After a few minutes, the flight attendants began their service, pushing carts filled with drinks and refreshments. The clinking of glasses and soft chatter filled the air as first-class passengers were offered their selections: champagne, wine, fresh juice, and sparkling water. When the cart reached his row, Dorian opened his eyes and waited. Julia stopped beside him, barely making eye contact as she poured a glass of sparkling water for the passenger next to him. The older woman in the seat across from him, Margot Ellison, received a polite smile as she was offered her choice of drink. But when Dorian finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Julia hesitated for barely a second before responding in a clipped tone. "We'll be serving drinks later." He glanced at the tray in front of her, where glasses of water sat untouched. "You're serving them now." She sighed, the kind of sigh meant to show irritation, as if he had asked for something unreasonable. "I'll come back." Without another word, she pushed the cart forward, leaving him sitting there, his request ignored. The other passengers barely noticed. A few shifted in their seats, pretending not to hear. Margot hesitated for a moment, glancing at him before quickly turning away. Dorian exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He could already tell how this would go. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't here to prove anything. But there were some things he would not ignore. Julia continued her service, making sure every other passenger in first class had exactly what they wanted. Yet she never looked back at him. A few rows behind, Hannah Porter, a younger flight attendant, had been watching the exchange. Her brow furrowed slightly as she noticed the clear dismissal, but she kept quiet, unsure if it was her place to say anything. She knew Julia well enough to understand that challenging her wasn't easy. Reaching into his pocket, Dorian pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. It was short, only a few words, but it was enough. He hit send, then placed the phone down, his expression unchanged. He knew what would happen next. He had seen it before. But this time, the consequences wouldn't be his to bear. The flight continued smoothly, but the air around Dorian felt heavier. He sat still, his posture relaxed, but his mind was anything but. The quiet hum of conversation and the occasional clinking of glasses filled the first-class cabin. Yet Julia never returned. She moved up and down the aisle, refilling drinks for others, exchanging pleasant small talk, and making sure every passenger felt taken care of, except him. Margot, seated across from Dorian, glanced at him again before turning her focus to her glass. She shifted uncomfortably, the tension creeping into her awareness. She had seen what happened. Everyone nearby had, but no one said anything. A few rows back, Hannah discreetly observed the situation. She had noticed Julia's behavior before, but this time it felt different. She saw the way Julia's demeanor changed depending on who she was speaking to. It wasn't just about service, it was about something else, something unspoken but obvious. Hannah bit the inside of her cheek, debating whether she should intervene. Meanwhile, Dorian's phone buzzed against the seat's armrest. He lifted it, reading the response to his earlier message. Noted, stay seated. That was all it said. No anger, no urgency, just 2 words. Dorian's expression didn't change, but a quiet understanding settled in his chest. He placed the phone down, folded his hands over his lap, and waited. He didn't need to do anything else. Up in the front of the plane, Julia continued moving through the cabin, still ignoring the seat she had deliberately skipped. She felt no guilt. To her, the situation had already been dealt with. If he wanted water, he could wait. It wasn't like he was anyone important, but what she didn't know was that a simple glass of water was about to change everything. The steady hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as Julia made her way back to the galley, her posture upright, her movements precise. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, satisfied that the situation had been handled. The man in seat 3A, Dorian, hadn't made a scene. He had simply accepted her answer and remained silent. That was enough for her. In the galley, Hannah was refilling a tray of drinks when Julia entered. The younger flight attendant hesitated before speaking. "You skipped him." Julia barely looked up. "Skipped who?" Hannah set down the bottle in her hand. "The man in 3A. He asked for water." Julia sighed and shook her head. "We have a process, Hannah. I told him we'd serve drinks later." Hannah frowned. "But you were already serving drinks." Julia's gaze sharpened. "Is there a problem?" Hannah hesitated. She knew how Julia operated. Sharp, dismissive, always in control. But something about this didn't sit right. Before she could decide whether to press further, a sudden crackle from the intercom interrupted them. "Ms. Vaughn, please report to the cockpit immediately." Julia stiffened. The call was unexpected. Flight attendants weren't usually summoned to the cockpit unless there was an issue, and she had made sure everything was running smoothly. Puzzled but composed, she straightened her uniform and gave Hannah a look. "Watch the galley." Then she turned and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. As she passed through the first-class cabin, she didn't glance at Dorian. She didn't see how he sat there, still and composed, his gaze steady as he watched her disappear behind the cockpit door. The moment she stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind her, sealing her fate in a way she never saw coming. The cockpit was dimly lit, the glow from the instrument panels casting a soft blue hue over the space. Captain Reed Lancaster, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, sat in his chair, his hands resting firmly on the controls. Standing beside him was Elliot Grayson, the in-flight operations supervisor, whose expression was unreadable. The moment Julia stepped inside, the tension in the air became thick enough to suffocate. "Is something wrong, Captain?" Julia asked, her voice steady, though a flicker of unease settled in her stomach. Captain Lancaster didn't answer right away. Instead, Elliot crossed his arms and spoke first. "We received a call from ground control. It seems there's a situation in the first-class cabin that requires clarification." Julia blinked, confused. "I don't understand." Elliot's gaze didn't waver. "A first-class passenger was denied service. Would you like to explain why?" Her stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. "I told him I'd serve him later. I was following procedure." The captain's jaw tightened. "Were you?" Julia straightened her shoulders, sensing an underlying challenge in his tone. "Yes. I had other passengers to tend to first. I wasn't ignoring him." Elliot took a slow breath before speaking again, this time with a deliberate edge. "Did you check the flight manifest before assuming he didn't belong in first class?" Julia faltered for half a second, just enough for Elliot to notice. Her hands curled slightly at her sides. "I didn't assume anything." Elliot's eyes darkened as he tapped a small stack of papers against his palm. Then why is it that every other passenger was served, but Father Dorian Hale was the only one asked to wait? The name sent a cold chill up Julia's spine. Father? Her lips parted slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction. I didn't realize. You didn't realize, Elliot repeated, his voice flat. He exchanged a glance with Captain Lancaster before continuing. Did you also not realize that Father Dorian Hale isn't just any passenger? Julia swallowed hard. Something in Elliot's tone made her uneasy. The supervisor leaned in slightly, his next words landing like a stone in her chest. His family owns this airline. Silence filled the cockpit. Julia felt her pulse hammering beneath her skin. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to process the weight of her mistake. Captain Lancaster's voice was calm, but firm. Ground control has been informed. You are to return to the cabin, personally apologize to Father Hale in front of the first-class passengers, and serve him whatever he requests, immediately. Julia's throat tightened. Captain, This is not a request. The captain's voice dropped, sharp as steel. Fix this, now. Julia hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a nod. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stepped out of the cockpit. But as she made her way back down the aisle, her legs felt heavier than before. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control. Julia walked down the aisle with stiff, calculated steps, her mind racing. The captain's words replayed in her head. His family owns this airline. It didn't make sense. The man in 3A looked nothing like the powerful executive she had served in first class before. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, he wasn't flashing a designer watch, and he hadn't carried himself with the arrogance of someone who thought they owned the sky. But now everything had shifted. Passengers barely noticed her return at first, lost in their own conversations, until she stopped beside seat 3A. Dorian hadn't moved. His posture was still calm, his hands resting loosely on his lap. He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with an unreadable expression. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. And somehow that unsettled her more than if he had been furious. The murmurs around them faded as a few nearby passengers sensed the shift in energy. Julia's throat tightened, but she forced herself to straighten her shoulders. She had done hundreds of service apologies in the past, always with a polished smile and just enough charm to smooth things over. But this time, she knew those tricks wouldn't work. She took a shallow breath. She caught herself. Father Hale. She forced a thin smile. I wanted to personally apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Dorian said nothing. He just watched her. Julia felt the weight of the silence stretching between them. Her palms grew clammy, but she pressed on. It wasn't my intention to make you feel unwelcome in first class. I should have served you right away. Dorian's eyes flickered with something. Was it amusement? It was subtle, but it was there. He let the silence sit for another long moment before finally speaking. You're saying it was a misunderstanding? Julia nodded quickly. Yes. Dorian tilted his head slightly. And what exactly did you misunderstand? Her breath caught for just a second. The question wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. Around them, a few passengers had now fully turned their attention to the exchange. Even Margot Ellison, who had kept silent before, was watching with interest. Julia felt her composure slipping. She had expected a quick, impersonal apology. Say the words, serve the water, move on. But Dorian wasn't letting her escape that easily. She forced a tight smile. I assumed you could wait for service. That was my mistake. Dorian's gaze didn't waver. You assumed I could wait, he repeated slowly, his voice quiet yet firm. Did you ask anyone else in first class to wait? Julia's stomach twisted. She could feel eyes on her now. Passengers, crew members, even Hannah, who had paused near the galley to watch. She hesitated for a second too long. Dorian leaned back in his seat, never breaking eye contact. If you're going to apologize, he said smoothly, at least tell the truth. Heat crawled up Julia's neck. Her usual confidence was slipping, crumbling under the weight of the moment. She had spent years maintaining control in situations like this, but now she was being forced to acknowledge what she had done, and this time, there was no way out. She swallowed hard. misjudged you." Dorian finally looked away, reaching for the glass of water she had just placed in front of him. He lifted it, took a slow sip, then set it back down. His voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in his words. "Yes, you did." The conversation was over. Julia stood there, her face burning, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the galley. But with every step, she felt the weight of her mistake sinking deeper. And for the first time, she knew this wasn't over. Julia stepped into the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath came faster than usual, and the chatter from the first-class cabin seemed distant, muffled beneath the pounding in her ears. She had delivered the apology. She had served the water. It should have been over, but it wasn't. The way Father Dorian Hale had looked at her, the quiet confidence, the calm authority, unsettled her more than anger ever could. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene, but he had made her feel small, and that was something Julia wasn't used to. Across the galley, Hannah Porter was watching her, arms crossed. She had seen everything. Julia could feel it. The weight of her stare, the unspoken judgment. Finally, Hannah broke the silence. "That didn't go how you thought it would, huh?" Julia shot her a glare. "Stay out of it." Hannah didn't move. "You really should have just given him the water." Julia scoffed, grabbing a napkin and wiping down a tray with more force than necessary. "And now you're going to lecture me?" Hannah shrugged. "Not a lecture, just an observation." Julia exhaled sharply, shaking her head. It was a simple mistake. It's done. But even as she said the words, something inside her knew they weren't true. The in-flight phone buzzed suddenly, making Julia flinch. Hannah arched an eyebrow. "That's probably for you." Julia hesitated before reaching for the receiver. She brought it to her ear, forcing her voice to stay steady. "This is Julia Vaughn." A calm yet firm voice came through the line. "Elliot Grayson." "Ms. Vaughn, Mr. Nathaniel Hale will be waiting at the gate when we land. He wants to have a word with you." Julia's heart stopped. Nathaniel Hale, Father Dorian Hale's brother, Chief Executive Officer of the airline. She gripped the phone tighter, her mouth suddenly dry. I understand." The line clicked off. Hannah leaned against the counter, her expression unreadable. "Bad news?" Julia didn't answer. She just placed the phone down and stared at it, her mind racing. This wasn't done, not even close. And now the real consequences were waiting for her, just beyond the runway. The flight continued as if nothing had happened, but Julia felt every second stretch longer than the last. Passengers chatted, some dozed off, while others tapped away on their laptops. The normalcy of it all made her stomach churn. Nathaniel Hale was waiting at the gate. That single thought kept repeating in her head like a siren she couldn't turn off. She forced herself to move, to go through the motions of her duties. She checked on passengers, straightened trays, and pretended not to notice the subtle glances being thrown her way. People had heard, they had seen. She could feel their quiet judgment pressing against her like a weight she couldn't shake off. Back in first class, Father Dorian Hale sat comfortably, his posture relaxed as he scrolled through his phone. He had sent only one more message since his brief exchange with Julia. "Landing in 1 hour. Let me know if you need anything handled." The response came quickly. "Already in motion. See you soon." Dorian smiled faintly and set the phone aside. He wasn't a man who enjoyed using power to make a statement, but there were times when people needed to learn, and Julia Vaughn was about to learn in a way she would never forget. Julia tried to keep herself distracted, but her nerves betrayed her. She poured a cup of tea for an elderly passenger, only to realize too late that her hands were shaking. The hot liquid sloshed over the rim, narrowly missing the man's hand. "Careful," he muttered, pulling back slightly. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry." She quickly placed the cup on his tray and stepped back, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Hannah, who had been watching from a few rows away, sighed under her breath. She wasn't enjoying Julia's unraveling, but she wasn't about to feel sorry for her either. As Julia turned toward the galley, she caught a glimpse of Margot Ellison staring at her, a thoughtful expression on her face. The older woman had been silent during the entire ordeal earlier, But now there was something in her gaze that sent another wave of unease through Julia. It wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity, it was disappointment. Julia quickly looked away, retreating to the galley, her breaths uneven. 1 more hour, 60 more minutes until she would have to face Nathaniel Hale. And she already knew. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation. The minutes dragged, each one pressing down on Julia like a weight she couldn't shake off. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her hands weren't as steady as they had been at the start of the flight. She felt the heat of quiet stares from passengers who had witnessed her misstep. None of them spoke to her directly, but their silence carried its own judgment. She had handled difficult passengers before. She had put people in their place, asserted her authority when needed. But this time was different. This time, the passenger she had dismissed wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was the brother of the man who ran the airline, and now she was about to pay the price for it. From his seat, Father Dorian Hale remained composed, unaffected by the subtle tension that had wrapped itself around the first-class cabin. He wasn't the type to hold grudges. He wasn't interested in watching Julia squirm under pressure. What he cared about was something far greater: accountability. His gaze drifted across the cabin, taking in the quiet reactions of those around him. Margot Ellison, the older woman who had been seated across from him, had been watching everything since the beginning. She wasn't loud, nor had she intervened earlier, but her expression now made it clear. She had seen enough to know exactly what had happened. Dorian turned his head slightly, catching sight of Hannah Porter standing near the galley. The young flight attendant had done nothing wrong, yet she looked tense, her fingers gripping the edge of a service tray a little too tightly. Dorian had noticed her unease earlier. She had seen the moment Julia dismissed him. She had known it wasn't right. But what had stopped her from speaking up? Fear of Julia? Fear of making things worse? Dorian understood hesitation, but silence had consequences. Julia, meanwhile, felt the pressure building with every breath. Her usual confidence had started to crack the moment she walked out of the cockpit, and now it was barely holding together. She had never been in this position before, on the receiving end of scrutiny, with no way to regain control. For a fleeting second, she considered marching up to Dorian and properly apologizing, really apologizing, without the fake pleasantries she had used earlier. But something held her back. Pride, stubbornness, or the sinking knowledge that an apology wouldn't fix what she had done. She turned toward the galley, needing a moment away from the eyes that seemed to burn through her. As she stepped inside, Hannah finally spoke. "You nervous?" Julia froze, her back still turned. "Excuse me?" Hannah set a tray down and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I mean, you should be. You do know who Nathaniel Hale is, right?" Julia spun around, her expression tight. "Of course I know." Hannah nodded slowly. "And yet, you still thought it was a good idea to act like he didn't belong up here." Julia's fingers curled at her sides. "I wasn't thinking about who he was." Hannah arched a brow. "Exactly." Julia stiffened, but she had no comeback. She didn't like Hannah's tone. Calm, pointed, not mocking, just matter of fact. And the worst part, Hannah was right. After a tense pause, Hannah let out a breath and shook her head. "You know, I almost stepped in earlier. Almost told you to just give him the damn water. But I didn't." Julia eyed her cautiously. "And why is that?" Hannah let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Because I figured you'd get yourself into trouble all on your own." Julia's face burned, but before she could snap back, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The message sent a fresh wave of dread through Julia. This was it. The countdown had begun. She turned away from Hannah without another word, straightened her uniform, and stepped back into the cabin, willing herself to stay composed. But her hands were still shaking. Julia moved through the first-class cabin, adjusting seatbelts, collecting empty glasses, and pretending everything was fine. But nothing was fine. Her body moved on autopilot, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. Every step toward landing was a step closer to Nathaniel Hale, and she had no idea what would happen when she finally had to face him. She stole a glance toward Father Dorian Hale, but he wasn't looking at her. He sat comfortably, glancing out the window as the plane began its descent. His phone rested on his lap, and Julia had the unsettling feeling that he had already sent every message that needed to be sent. Passengers around him had noticed the shift in energy. Margot Ellison, the older woman who had observed everything from the start, gave Julia a pointed look when she passed by. It wasn't cruel or mocking, it was something worse, disappointed. Julia gritted her teeth and hurried back toward the galley, where Hannah Porter was finishing up the last-minute preparations. Hannah didn't say anything at first, but when Julia reached for a tray, her hand trembled slightly. Hannah noticed. "You look like you're about to be sick," Hannah muttered, her tone neither sympathetic nor cruel. Julia tightened her grip on the tray. "I'll be fine." Hannah gave a small shrug. "Sure." Silence stretched between them before Hannah spoke again, this time quieter. "You know, if you just treated him like every other first-class passenger, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Julia exhaled sharply. "And if you felt so strongly about it, why didn't you say something when it happened?" Hannah stilled for a moment, then looked Julia directly in the eye. "Because people like you don't listen to people like me." The words cut deeper than Julia expected. She wanted to argue, to push back, but she couldn't. Instead, she turned away and grabbed a cloth, scrubbing at an already spotless surface just to keep herself busy. The tension between them was thick, but before anything else could be said, the intercom buzzed again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Julia straightened, inhaling sharply. This is it. She walked back into the first-class cabin, forcing herself to focus on the passengers, not on the growing weight pressing down on her. She checked seatbelts, nodded politely at those who met her gaze, and avoided looking at Dorian Hale entirely. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was enough. The plane began its final descent, tilting slightly as the runway came into view through the windows. Julia felt her pulse quicken, her grip tightening on the back of an empty seat. The moment those wheels touched the ground, she would have minutes, maybe seconds, before she had to face Nathaniel Hale. Across the aisle, Margot adjusted her scarf and spoke just loud enough for Julia to hear. "You should have just given him the water." Julia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The wheels hit the ground with a smooth but firm landing. A few passengers clapped politely, the usual habit of those relieved to be back on solid ground. The intercom clicked on again, and Captain Reed Lancaster's voice came through, calm as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today." Julia barely heard the words. She was staring at the jet bridge coming into view, and standing just beyond the glass, Nathaniel Hale, tall, unshaken, waiting. Julia's stomach twisted into a knot so tight she thought she might actually collapse. This was about to get much worse. The plane taxied toward the gate, but Julia barely registered the movement. Her pulse pounded in her ears as her gaze remained locked on Nathaniel Hale, standing just beyond the jet bridge window. His posture was perfectly composed, shoulders squared, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. He wasn't tapping his foot impatiently or checking his watch. He was just waiting. That made it worse. She had dealt with upset passengers before. People who yelled, demanded compensation, and threw tantrums. Those people were easy to handle. Nathaniel Hale wasn't going to yell. He didn't have to. The aircraft came to a smooth stop. The final ding of the seatbelt sign switching off was met with the usual rustling of passengers gathering their belongings, but Julia barely heard it. She stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the edge of the counter as she forced herself to breathe evenly. Through the sea of movement, Father Dorian Hale remained seated, unhurried. He wasn't reaching for his bag. He wasn't making any effort to rush toward the exit like the others. Instead, he simply waited, his fingers loosely clasped together. For the first time, Julia had to fight the urge to beg for another chance. The front door of the plane opened with a sharp hiss, and Nathaniel stepped forward. The first-class passengers shifted, some sneaking glances, others pretending not to notice the man who controlled the very airline they had just flown on. His presence carried weight, even among those who didn't know exactly what was happening. Nathaniel stepped just inside the plane, his eyes scanning the cabin before settling directly on Dorian. The two brothers exchanged a silent look, one that lasted only a second, but was heavy with understanding. Nathaniel's gaze then moved, landing unflinchingly on Julia. She nearly shrank back, but caught herself. She wasn't weak. She had been in this industry for years. She had handled difficult situations before. She could talk her way out of this. She just needed to be careful. Nathaniel didn't say a word at first. Instead, he glanced toward the flight supervisor, Elliot Grayson, who had just stepped onto the plane behind him. "Make sure the passengers exit smoothly," Nathaniel instructed in a calm, controlled voice. Elliot gave a slight nod, already motioning for the crew to assist. Nathaniel took a step closer to Julia. She swallowed, straightening her posture. "Mr. Hale, He lifted a single hand, silencing her instantly. The plane was still full of passengers, some pretending not to listen, but very much tuned into the exchange. Nathaniel didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, the authority in his tone made Julia's stomach churn. "Walk with me, now." Her breath hitched. This was worse than she had imagined. He wasn't addressing the situation in front of everyone. He wanted her to step off the plane with him. The walk down the jet bridge felt longer than any flight she had ever taken. Nathaniel didn't look at her as they walked, and that silence was suffocating. Julia's heart pounded so loudly she thought he might hear it. As soon as they stepped into a private executive lounge near the gate, Nathaniel shut the door behind them. The moment it clicked into place, everything changed. The calm disappeared. Nathaniel turned to face her fully, his expression now a storm of quiet intensity. "You really thought no one would notice?" His voice wasn't loud, but the weight behind it was like a hammer. Julia's throat tightened. I didn't." Nathaniel took a slow step forward, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. "Let's not waste time with excuses, Ms. Vaughn. A priest, a man who dedicates his life to serving others, asked for something as simple as a glass of water, and you decided he wasn't worth it." Julia's breath caught in her throat. The way he said it made it sound so much worse. And yet, wasn't that exactly what had happened? Nathaniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You could have made a different choice. You could have treated him the way you treated every other first-class passenger. But you didn't." Julia felt her last shred of confidence crumbling. "Mr. Hale, I understand I made a mistake." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Number A mistake is forgetting a drink order. This was a decision." Her stomach twisted. Nathaniel folded his arms, his voice lowering. "If he had been wearing a suit and an expensive watch, would you have told him to wait?" Julia's silence was answer enough. Nathaniel let it linger, watching the realization settle on her face. She knew she had no defense, no way to spin this. "You know how many times people like my brother have been dismissed by people like you?" Nathaniel's voice was calm, but the underlying anger was unmistakable. "How many times he's been looked at like he doesn't belong?" Julia had no response. Nathaniel finally straightened, the decision already made. "Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending a full review by the executive board." The word struck like a blow to the chest. Suspended, without pay. She had worked for this airline for years. She had built a career, a reputation, and now it was all crumbling. Nathaniel's tone didn't waver. "I don't expect you to understand this right now, Ms. Vaughn, but maybe when you're sitting at home, wondering how everything fell apart so fast, you'll think about how quickly you dismissed someone over something as basic as a drink of water." Julia felt the weight of the room pressing down on her, the suffocating reality of what had just happened. But Nathaniel wasn't done. "There's one more thing." His voice was sharp, final. Julia barely lifted her head. "You will personally file an incident report explaining exactly what happened. No revisions, no watering it down. And when the board reads it, they will decide whether or not you deserve to step foot on another one of our flights ever again." A cold chill ran down Julia's spine. She opened her mouth wanting to plead, to ask for another chance. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Nathaniel studied her for another brief moment before stepping toward the door. "I hope," he said as he pulled it open, "that this is the last time I ever have to hear your name." And with that, he walked out, leaving Julia standing in the empty room. the weight of her choices crashing down around her. Julia stood frozen in the executive lounge, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. The door had closed behind Nathaniel Hale, but his words still echoed in her head. Suspended, without pay, pending full review. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She had known this would be bad, but this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was career-ending. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. How had this happened so fast? One wrong moment, one decision she had made without thinking, and now she was standing in an empty room, with her future crumbling beneath her. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had spent years perfecting the image of control, poised, authoritative, untouchable. But now, for the first time in her career, she had no control at all. She turned slowly, staring at the empty conference table in front of her. The very table where airline executives made decisions about employees like her, who stayed, who left, who got second chances. Would she even get one? Her mind raced with possibilities. Could she fight this? Argue that it had been a misunderstanding? Maybe if she explained herself better, the board would see that this wasn't worth ruining her career over. But deep down, she knew the truth. Nathaniel Hale hadn't spoken in anger. He hadn't made a hasty decision. Everything he said had been measured, deliberate, final. She had been dismissed, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her knees suddenly felt weak, and she sank into one of the empty chairs, pressing her hands against her forehead. For years, she had walked through airports with confidence, her uniform pristine, her head held high. Passengers respected her. Fellow flight attendants listened to her. She had been someone, but now, she was just another employee waiting to hear if she would ever work again. A soft knock on the door made her snap upright, her stomach lurching. For half a second, she thought it was Nathaniel Hale, back to deliver the final blow. But when the door opened, it wasn't him. It was Elliot Grayson. The in-flight supervisor stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was unreadable, but the way he exhaled before speaking told Julia everything she needed to know. "This is bad, Julia." His voice was firm but not unkind. She swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the chair. "I know." Elliot crossed his arms. "Do you?" Julia's jaw clenched, the defensive part of her kicking in. "It was one mistake, Elliot." He didn't react. "One mistake?" He tilted his head slightly. "Would you call it that if it had happened to someone else? If another flight attendant had treated a first-class passenger that way?" Julia's nails dug into the fabric of the chair. "I didn't mean to, but you did." Elliot cut her off, his voice steady. "And you need to accept that. Because if you try to fight this, if you sit in front of the board and act like you're the victim, they will fire you on the spot." A sharp sting of panic ran through Julia's chest. Elliot sighed, running a hand over his face. "Do you even understand who you humiliated today?" Julia flinched. "I know who he is now." Elliot gave a humorless chuckle. "Not just who he is, what he represents." He shook his head, his voice dropping slightly. "You didn't just deny service to a random passenger. You denied service to a man of faith, a man who has spent his life advocating for people who are treated unfairly, a man whose family built this airline." Julia's throat tightened. Elliot exhaled. "And let's not forget the passengers who watched it all happen. They saw you serve everyone else. They saw you ignore him. You don't think at least a few of them have already written complaints?" Julia hadn't thought of that. Her stomach dropped. One complaint from a passenger was an issue. But multiple complaints? That was proof. The weight of it all came crashing down on her. And for the first time since she had walked off that plane, Julia felt something close to fear. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Elliot studied her for a long moment. "That depends," she swallowed. "On what?" "On whether or not you're actually sorry," he said simply. Julia stiffened. Elliot leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You can write your report, follow protocol, and try to get through this with the hope that the board will be lenient. Or, you can do the one thing you've never had to do before." Julia frowned. "And what's that?" Elliot's next words landed like a stone in her chest. "Admit that you were wrong." She said nothing. because for the first time in years, she had nothing to say. Julia sat frozen in the chair, Elliot's words settling over her like a weight she wasn't prepared to carry. Admit that you were wrong. The idea twisted inside her, uncomfortable, foreign. She had spent years asserting herself, standing firm in every situation, never bending unless absolutely necessary. But now she was being told that the only way to save her career was to let go of the very thing that had made her successful, her control. She inhaled sharply. I wasn't trying to be cruel. Elliot didn't react. He just watched. I didn't mean for it to be personal, she said, the words stiff in her throat. I was busy. I was managing a full cabin. I didn't think. Elliot let out a slow, measured breath before replying. And that's the problem. Her fingers curled around the edge of the chair. I've seen people try to sneak into first class before. I assumed. Elliot's jaw tightened. You assumed? Julia flinched. Yeah, that's the part you don't seem to understand, Elliot continued, his voice steady but sharp. You assumed he didn't belong. And because of that assumption, you treated him differently. Julia opened her mouth to argue, but what was there to argue? Elliot leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. You think this is just about you? About your job? He shook his head. You didn't just make a bad call. You embarrassed a man who didn't deserve it. You humiliated someone who has spent his entire life standing up for people who have been dismissed the way you dismissed him. Julia swallowed hard. You know what makes this worse? Elliot asked, his voice quieter now. This wasn't even about money. You weren't withholding some exclusive service or an upgrade. He asked for water. That part stung the most. Water. Something so basic. Something she wouldn't have denied to anyone else. Elliot watched the flicker of realization cross her face. Now you're starting to get it. Julia exhaled shakily, pressing her palms against her knees. I didn't think it would go this far, she admitted. You never do, Elliot said. Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Julia had always prided herself on keeping things under control, but this was slipping beyond her grasp faster than she could manage. She clenched her jaw. You think an apology will fix this? Elliot studied her for a long moment. No, he said honestly, but it's a start. She scoffed. Right. I'll just apologize, and Nathaniel Hale will forgive me, and everything will go back to normal? Elliot arched a brow. Is that what you're hoping for? Julia's throat tightened. What was she hoping for? A second chance? For this all to disappear? Or was she just looking for a way to walk away from this with some of her dignity intact? She didn't answer. Elliot sighed and leaned back. You don't get it yet. The apology isn't for them. It's for you. She frowned. What does that even mean? Elliot studied her, as if debating whether she was even capable of understanding what he was about to say. Because if you don't own this, if you don't face what you did and actually learn from it, then you're going to carry this moment with you for the rest of your life. You'll leave this airline, go somewhere else, and one day you'll make the same mistake again. Maybe it won't be on a plane. Maybe it won't be about water, but it will happen. Julia hated how much those words hit her, because deep down, she knew he was right. She had never thought about the way she treated certain passengers. It had always been second nature. Who got a warm greeting, who got a half-hearted nod, who she smiled at, who she overlooked. She had never thought about it before, but now she was. Elliot stood up. The board is expecting your incident report by the end of the day. Think carefully about what you write, Julia. She hesitated. And if I don't? He turned back to her, his face unreadable. Then this is the end of your career. His words weren't a threat. They were a promise. Julia sat there watching as he walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the reality she had spent the entire flight trying to avoid. For the first time in years, she had no one else to blame, just herself. Julia sat alone in the executive lounge long after Elliot left, her mind tangled in thoughts she didn't want to face. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, and for the first time in her career, she felt like an outsider in an airport, a place that had always felt like home. She had built her life in the sky. The long hours, the constant travel, the uniform that gave her a sense of control. It was all she had ever known. And now it was slipping away because of a moment that she had barely thought twice about at the time. But now it was all she could think about. The weight of it settled deeper in her chest as she pulled out her airline-issued tablet, her fingers hovering over the screen. The incident report was already open, waiting for her to type her statement. The cursor blinked in front of her, taunting her. What was she even supposed to say? She could lie. She could soften the truth, make it seem like a simple misunderstanding. Write about how busy she had been, how she had meant to serve Father Dorian Hale, but had gotten distracted. But the truth sat in her stomach like a stone. She hadn't forgotten him. She hadn't been too busy. She had seen him and ignored him anyway. Her fingers tightened around the tablet. Nathaniel Hale's words echoed in her head. A mistake is forgetting a drink order. This was a decision. Julia squeezed her eyes shut, exhaling slowly. She had spent her entire career making split-second judgments about people. She had prided herself on knowing who was important, who was worth the extra effort, and who wasn't. And now she had to sit here and acknowledge that she had been wrong. She opened her eyes and slowly began to type. Incident report. Julia Vaughn. On Flight 482, I was responsible for first-class service. During drink service, I provided beverages to all passengers except for Father Dorian Hale. When he requested a glass of water, I told him I would serve him later. However, I continued to serve other passengers while deliberately skipping his request. Her hands hesitated over the keyboard. The next part was the hardest. My decision was not based on standard protocol. It was based on an assumption. I did not verify his ticket. I did not check the manifest. I saw him and made a decision about whether or not he belonged. That decision was not based on policy or training. It was a judgment I made entirely on my own. Her throat tightened as she stared at the words. Everything inside her hated admitting it. For years, she had built her career on control, on never second-guessing herself, on always standing by her choices. But now, for the first time, she was truly facing one of them. She forced herself to keep going. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not an accident. I chose to dismiss him. I understand now that my actions were not just a failure in customer service, but a failure in basic human decency. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed the last part. I accept full responsibility for this decision and its consequences. She let out a slow, shaky breath, rereading what she had written. No excuses, no justifications, just the truth. Her hands hovered over the screen for another long moment before she finally tapped submit. The moment the report was sent, she felt something she hadn't expected: relief. The sinking in her chest didn't disappear, but for the first time since the flight, the tight coil of anxiety that had been crushing her ribs loosened slightly. She couldn't undo what she had done, but at least for the first time, she wasn't trying to pretend it hadn't happened. A sharp knock on the door made her snap back to reality. She turned just as the door opened, and her stomach twisted at the sight of the last person she expected to see. Father Dorian Hale. He stood just inside the doorway, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the room with quiet authority. He wasn't dressed in his priest collar, just a simple buttoned-up shirt and slacks. Yet there was something about him that commanded more respect than a suit ever could. Julia shot up from her chair instinctively, her throat dry. Father Hale. Dorian studied her for a moment before stepping forward. Nathaniel told me you submitted your report. She swallowed hard, nodding. I told the truth. Dorian tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. And why is that? Julia's fingers curled slightly. She could have given an easy answer. She could have told him what he wanted to hear. Instead, she found herself saying something real. Because I finally realized how much I didn't want to, she admitted, her voice quiet. And that was the problem. Dorian was silent for a moment before nodding slowly. Good. The word was simple, but it carried more weight than she had expected. Julia hesitated before speaking again. I know it doesn't change what I did, but I am sorry. Dorian exhaled, crossing his arms as he studied her. "Do you know how many times I've been ignored like that?" Julia swallowed. "More than you should have." He nodded. "More than anyone should have." He let the words settle before continuing. "What you did was wrong. You let an assumption dictate how you treated someone. That's not something you can take back." Julia braced herself for him to tell her she didn't deserve forgiveness. But he didn't. Instead, he said something that shocked her. "But if you meant what you said in that report, if you actually understand what you did, then you have a chance to make sure you never do it again." She blinked, caught off guard. "You think I deserve that chance?" Dorian's expression remained steady. "That's not my decision." Julia frowned, slightly confused. "Then whose is it?" Dorian looked at her, his voice calm but firm. "Yours." His words landed heavier than she expected. This wasn't about what the airline decided. It wasn't even about what Nathaniel or the executive board chose to do with her. It was about whether she would choose to be the kind of person who actually learned. Dorian glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting to get to." He turned toward the door before pausing. "One last thing." Julia held her breath. "If you're given a second chance," Dorian said, his voice quiet but certain, "make sure you earn it." And with that, he walked out, leaving Julia alone once again. She sat back down slowly, staring at the door long after it closed. For the first time since this all started, she wasn't thinking about what came next. She was thinking about who she was going to be if she got the chance to stay. Julia sat in silence long after Father Dorian Hale left the room, her mind churning. The door had closed behind him, but his words lingered in the air like an echo she couldn't shake. "If you're given a second chance, make sure you earn it." It should have been a relief, a chance, a glimmer of hope. But instead it felt like a burden, because for the first time, the weight of change was on her. She wasn't used to this. Being wrong, being held accountable. She had spent years brushing off mistakes, defending her decisions, standing by every judgment she had ever made, whether right or wrong. It was who she was. But now that version of herself, the untouchable Julia Vaughn, was slipping away. And what terrified her most was that she didn't know what was left underneath. She exhaled shakily, running a hand over her face. She had told the truth in her report. She had admitted her mistake, acknowledged her assumptions, and for the first time, she had let herself see what others saw. But was that enough? Would the airline forgive her? Would she even deserve it if they did? Her tablet buzzed on the table, snapping her back to reality. She hesitated before picking it up, her pulse spiking when she saw the sender. Nathaniel Hale. Her hands felt clumsy as she tapped the notification, the screen filling with a short but decisive message. "Julia Vaughn, the executive board has reviewed your report. You are required to meet in conference room B at 5 p.m. A final decision regarding your position will be made at that time." Nathaniel Hale. Julia checked the clock. 4:12 p.m., less than an hour. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had known this was coming. The report was only the first step. Now she had to face them. She set the tablet down carefully, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. What would they decide? Would they fire her, suspend her longer, or would they give her a second chance? One she wasn't even sure she had earned. The thought made her chest tighten. A knock on the door made her jump slightly. She looked up, expecting Elliot or another supervisor, but instead it was Hannah Porter. Julia blinked, caught off guard. "What are you doing here?" Hannah stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I heard you submitted your report." Julia frowned slightly. "News travels fast." Hannah gave a small shrug. "People are watching. They want to see what happens to you." That stung more than it should have. Julia looked away. "Well, they'll find out soon enough. I have a meeting with the board in less than an hour." Hannah studied her for a long moment before speaking. "What did you write?" Julia hesitated. It would have been easy to downplay it, to act like it was just a routine corporate formality. But something about the way Hannah was looking at her, expecting more, made Julia feel like lying would only make this worse. So for the second time that day, she told the truth. "I told them everything," Julia said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "I admitted that I ignored him, that I judged him, that it wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Hannah didn't react right away. When she finally spoke, her tone was unreadable. "And why did you do that?" Julia let out a slow breath. "Because I finally realized that pretending it didn't happen wouldn't save me." Hannah's expression softened slightly, but she didn't let Julia off the hook so easily. "You really believe that?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." Silence stretched between them, but for the first time, it didn't feel hostile. Then Hannah smirked, just a little. "So how does it feel?" Julia frowned. "How does what feel?" "Realizing you're not the smartest person in the room." Julia exhaled, shaking her head. "Honestly?" She met Hannah's gaze. "It feels terrible." Hannah chuckled, leaning against the wall. "Good. That means you might actually learn something from it." Julia sighed, but there was no bite in her voice when she said, "Are you always this annoying?" Hannah grinned. "Only when people deserve it." Julia let out a tired laugh, the first real one she had managed all day. For the first time, she understood why Hannah had watched her so closely on that flight, why she had spoken up in the galley, why she hadn't let Julia's actions slide. She hadn't wanted to see Julia fail. She had wanted to see if Julia could change. And now Julia realized, so did she. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 5 p.m. The moment of truth was coming, and for the first time since she stepped off that plane, Julia was ready to face it. Julia sat outside conference room B, her hands resting on her lap, fingers intertwined so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. The waiting was unbearable. Every passing second stretched longer than it should, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. She had been in high-pressure situations before, dealing with irate passengers, managing in-flight emergencies, but nothing had ever felt this heavy. Because this wasn't about handling a difficult situation. This was about her. The glass walls of the executive corridor allowed her a clear view of the airline's top decision-makers inside the conference room. Nathaniel Hale sat at the head of the table, flipping through the report she had submitted. Elliot Grayson, the in-flight supervisor, was next to him, arms crossed, waiting. A few board members, including the airline's director of operations, were seated as well, their faces unreadable. Julia forced herself to breathe. She didn't know what was going to happen when she walked in there. Would they tear her apart? Would they fire her on the spot? Or, worst of all, would they give her a second chance and expect her to be worthy of it? A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You look like you're about to pass out." Julia turned sharply to see Hannah Porter standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her with something that almost resembled amusement. Julia exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't need an audience for this." Hannah leaned against the wall. "I'm not here for you. I was meeting with my supervisor, but then I saw you sitting here, looking like you'd rather be anywhere else." Julia didn't argue, because Hannah was right. Hannah studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Do you want to know something interesting?" Julia sighed. "Not particularly." Hannah ignored her. "Nathaniel Hale has fired 6 senior flight attendants in the last 3 years, all for things way smaller than this." Julia's stomach twisted. "That's not helping." Hannah tilted her head slightly. "You know what they all had in common?" Julia glanced at her warily. "What?" "They refused to take responsibility for their actions," Hannah said simply. "They argued, blamed others, said the passengers were overreacting." Julia swallowed. "And what happened to them?" Hannah shrugged. "They walked into that room with a defense, and they walked out without a job." Julia exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Great. Fantastic." Hannah smirked. "You, though? You don't have a defense, do you?" Julia hesitated, then shook her head. "No." Hannah's smirk faded. "Good." For once, Julia didn't push back. A sharp click echoed as the conference room door opened. Nathaniel Hale's assistant stepped out, glancing at Julia. "They're ready for you." Julia's heart slammed against her ribs. She stood slowly, her legs stiff, and turned to Hannah one last time. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Try not to get fired." Julia let out a breath. "Not sure that's up to me." Hannah's expression softened just slightly. "Maybe it is." Julia didn't have time to think about what that meant. She stepped inside the conference room, and the door shut behind her. The atmosphere inside the room was heavy. Nathaniel Hale sat at the head of the long table, his expression unreadable. The board members watched her carefully, some with mild disinterest, others with quiet scrutiny. Elliot sat to the side, arms crossed, waiting. Julia had never felt so small. Nathaniel didn't waste time. "Sit." Julia obeyed without hesitation, lowering herself into the chair directly across from him. Nathaniel rested his elbows on the table, clasping his hands together. "You submitted your report." Julia nodded. "Yes. We read it." Silence stretched between them. Nathaniel didn't blink as he spoke again. "Do you stand by what you wrote?" Julia swallowed hard. "Yes." Nathaniel leaned back slightly. "You admitted that you made an assumption about a passenger, that your actions weren't based on protocol, but personal judgment." Julia forced herself not to look away. "Yes." One of the board members, a woman with a sharp gaze, tapped a pen against the table. "Do you understand why this is serious?" Julia nodded. "Yes, because my actions weren't just bad service. They were a reflection of a deeper issue, one I never thought about until now." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "And what issue is that?" Julia inhaled. "Bias." The word felt foreign coming from her own mouth, but it was the truth. Nathaniel watched her carefully. "So you admit that's what this was?" Julia clenched her hands in her lap. "I admit that I made a judgment about someone based on nothing but my own assumptions, and that I treated him differently because of it." A long silence followed. One of the other board members, a man in his 60s, sighed and leaned back. "We've seen flight attendants get defensive in situations like this. They always try to justify it." Julia's stomach twisted, but she said nothing. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Your employment is under review, but I will be clear. You're already one step ahead of everyone who sat in that chair before you." Julia's breath caught. "What does that mean?" Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. "It means you didn't waste our time making excuses." She exhaled slowly, tension still gripping her chest. "So, what now?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "You are officially suspended for 4 weeks. Unpaid." The words hit hard. A month without work, no income, no flights, no uniform. But she forced herself to accept it. Nathaniel continued, "When your suspension is over, if you choose to return, you will be required to complete bias training, customer relations courses, and a probationary period before you are reinstated." Julia exhaled shakily. "So, I still have a job?" Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. "You have a chance to prove you deserve one." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't erasure of consequences. It was an opportunity. Julia swallowed the lump in her throat. "I understand." Nathaniel studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Then this meeting is over." Julia stood slowly, her legs unsteady. As she turned to leave, Nathaniel spoke again. "One more thing." She stopped, turning back. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. "I hope you understand that this is not for you." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel's voice remained calm but firm. "This isn't about saving your career. It's about proving that you actually learned something." Julia felt the words settle deep in her chest. Nathaniel leaned back, a finality in his voice. "So don't waste it." Julia nodded, then stepped out of the room, her heart pounding. She had 4 weeks to figure out who she was going to be, and this time, for the first time in her career, she was finally willing to learn. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.